Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's ranking of all ongoing romances. In this video I will look at the ongoing romances between main characters or supporting characters of any of the Star Trek series, the original series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, animated series, Discovery, movies, all that. And I will rank them from my least favorite to my favorite. Now, a few sort of disclaimers how I'm putting this sort of countdown together is that I'm only looking at ongoing relationships, so therefore to qualify, the romance had to be featured in more than one episode or more than one movie, which, to be frank, it eliminates the original series and, of course, the animated series, which neither appear on this list, because none of the relationships lasted more than one episode. Kirk was a bit of a floozy. Let's get it out there. So a lot of people might expect like a Kirk and Edith Keel to be high on my list. I'm sorry, it's not eligible. Only looking at ongoing. And also I sort of make the determination of what is a relationship, as some people may make different determinations or whatever, but I have to go, the line has to be drawn somewhere, and I had to sort of make that line. For example, I don't count Data and Yar as in this list because it was only sort of implied after she died. I mean, they did have that one night stand, but that's about it. It wasn't really an ongoing relationship, and they didn't mention any romantic feelings between the two until after she was dead, so I don't really count that. I do count something like Picard and Crusher, even though they never fully got together, except for in All Good Things they mentioned they were married, but most of the time it was just the relationship was platonic, but it did spark up here and now throughout the series, so I am counting that. And a few other relationships like that Shekar and Janeway, which never fully developed, but they did explore from here and there. So I am counting that. I am not including romantic relationship with inanimate objects. That's a whole list that included this. It had Kirk in the Enterprise and Quark and Gold Plush Latinum. No, I'm not counting that. Also not counting plutonic, strong plutonic relationships like O'Brien and Bashir. And I could go on a whole rant how it kind of annoys me because it's a sign of society's uncomfortableness with masculinity or men being able to have strong loving relationships that are not romantic, because women are seen to have strong relationships with each other, and no one accuses them of there must be lesbians. But whenever men do it, they must be gay, because no man could have a strong platonic relationship with another man. So that actually annoys me. But getting off topic, so I'm not including stuff like that. I'm sticking to stuff that was pretty straightforwardly, stated in the show itself, or had romantic aspects to this relationship, even if it wasn't always portrayed in the romantic fashion. Cool. Alright, so let me get into my top 25. So I ranked it, I set aside that there's 25 romances. So if there's any that are not on this list, it's because I didn't deem it eligible, or maybe I forgot it. But it's not because I didn't think it was good or I thought it was worse than any on this list. No, this isn't like a top 25, which is why I call it ranking, because I just determined there were 25 altogether. And so I'm going to rank them from my least favorite to my favorite. And so I decided to split this list into 3 categories. The good, the bad, and the average. So I start, of course, with the bad, and I'll let you know the section that I think are not good, and then we'll get to the average stuff, which I mostly like, but I don't think was like amazing or anything. And then we'll get to the good, which is stuff, the relationships I really did like. And also, another quick criteria for this countdown is I'm judging it on what was good for the story. What was good for the storytelling, what made sense for the characters, was it natural for the character stories, did it work to develop the character stories more, did it feel like it added to the show rather than detracted. That's what I'm judging this on, not like who had the most healthy relationship, or who I thought was cutest together, or something like that. Anyway, so let me start getting to my countdown. I'll start with the bad. So this category, I'll let you know when I get out of it. So these are all the romances I didn't think worked and I didn't like. And of course, I'll start with my number 25, which is my least favorite. So in my opinion, the worst romance in the Star Trek franchise. And that, of course, is Chakotay and Seven of Nine. Now, anyone who knows my channel, and it's kind of a running joke too, that any list I have the episode the Voyager finale Endgame is eligible for will always be my number one worst. Now, this list isn't about episodes, but Seven of Nine Chakotay romance was, of course, the main feature in Endgame. And yeah, I don't think it's just this episode. I am including it, even though the previous episode, Human Error, that featured this romance, it wasn't actually Chakotay, it was a Chakotay hologram, but I think that's good enough because they're still implying this was an implied romance that's just beyond this one episode. But it wasn't built up to at all. It made no sense. This, to me, is the clearest cut case of executive decision of business execs saying, like, smash these two characters together for money. And there was no story reasons. There was no character reasons. I do remember that this was originally the idea of the actor who played Chakotay, mainly because he was sick of his character being marginalized and wanted him to get more screen time, and saw that 7 of 9 was getting all the screen time, so wanted to sort of piggyback off of that, basically. And, and I talked about this in other videos, that there are ways this romance could have been done well. Like, there was something there they could have built off of, but they didn't. They just mashed these two characters together. They had no chemistry. It was stilted. These scenes are very, very painful to watch. This is definitely a case of horrible writing. Anyway, let me get into my number 24, which is, another one of the worst relationships in Star Trek, and this is Spock and Uhura. And I said at the top that I wasn't going to do an original series, and I stand by that. This is not an original series. This is Kelvinverse. This is the reboot. And this relationship sort of signifies everything I hate about the reboots, particularly that first film, which I think was god-awful. And because, again, this is another executive decision. This is something done by business execs to make it sexy, to ramp up the sex appeal. And, we can't just have characters on the bridge. We need to have two of them kissing. And there's just nothing there. It makes no sense. It's not just, you could say, you're just being a nerd because the original series, they never got together. No, I'm not. It's because they have no chemistry. It's because this relationship makes no sense, and it completely ruins Uhura's character. And it's not, to me, it's very like a given that the Star Trek Beyond, which is I think the best Kelvinverse film, the only one that really felt like Star Trek, that was written by true Star Trek fans, and one of the first thing that film did was to split these characters up. And that made complete and total sense. Anyway, let me get into number 23, which is Garrick and Yael. Now, there's another pairing which you'll find much higher on my list that a lot of people tend to point to for being uncomfortable with because of the age difference, but that one actually never bothered me as much. This one does, because Yael was 14 years old when she was introduced in season 4, and later towards the end of season 4, they got a different actress to play who was a bit older, maybe 16, and then that's when she started her friendship with Garrick. But then all of a sudden, season 5, they turned this into a romance. Granted, they did recast this actress yet again to be someone even older, who I think was like 18 or 19. But still, I mean, don't give me any BS about, Cardassians just age differently or have different culture, because that's just headcanon. You're just making that up. They don't actually have anything to explain that. They just... And it was just, even if you think of Yael as 18, it was still very uncomfortable, but arguably the character was 14. And, Garrick, of course, is a middle-aged man in his 40s or even 50s, but I think 40s would probably be more accurate. But still, like, why put these characters together? I think it made a lot more sense to have, because it first portrayed it as this platonic, more like a mentor relationship, like the kind of relationship you expect a middle-aged man to have with a teenager, that and that they related to each other because they were the only two Cardassians on the station, and they wanted to meet and talk about Cardassians sharing their similarities the way they couldn't with any other person. They should have kept a relationship like that, but in that two-parter in season 5, they're like, oh no, let's say that they're actually in love with each other in order to create drama with Dukat, who hates Garrick, which it just didn't work. And I think they realized this, which is why they never touched on it again. Even season 6, when Zial was killed off, they just had one line of Kira saying, oh, she loved you, I think, and that's it. And I didn't mind that, because they never should have done this in the first place. Anyway, let me get into number 22 on my list, which is Tom Paris and B'Elanna Torres, which, if you're not familiar with my channel, you might be surprised, because most people love this relationship. We rank it really highly. If you are familiar with my channel, I've ranted about this relationship a lot. I don't think it worked. There's that saying that even a broken clock is right twice a day, and because this relationship went on for so long, so many seasons, there were 1 or 2 episodes where it actually worked, and but that's just because they had it go on and go. And that's just the virtue of it being so long. But inherently, these characters had no chemistry whatsoever. And this is an ongoing theme, that the romances in Voyager were always worse than the romances in Deep Space Nine. And the main reason for that is because Rick Berman and producers had Voyager on the title lease, and they would always refuse the writers to make connections that seem natural. Instead, they would decree characters be together, and so it be done. Whereas Deep Space Nine, the writers more have done it unnatural. What they built off of chemistry that already naturally existed between two characters, and they took it in a natural direction. Whereas Voyager, and this is a clear case with B'Elanna and Tom. Now, granted, it wasn't as bad as Chakotay and 7-9. They didn't just shove them together immediately, but they had no established chemistry before season 3. And then once they decreed they be together, they started doing all these episodes where they were flirting and start trying to build a relationship, but it always felt fake to me. It always felt filth. I never bought the chemistry that, well, not never has said broken clock, but for the most part, there seemed nothing behind it. This seemed just like contrived writing, executive decision, and it ruined both their characters. B'Elanna used to be a very strong woman, a very independent character who was very interesting with her own demons that she had to fight off, and towards the end of this show, she was just Tom Paris's wife. And that's all she was relegated to. That's basically her whole characteristics that were shown in the part she played in the show. And plus, Tom was portrayed as someone who also had his own demons, who was more of a loner type and needed to trust people. And so putting him in a long-term relationship, making him the family man, is just, I think it ruined this character. It made no sense. Harry Kim was definitely the most obvious choice to be in a long-term relationship, and he had more chemistry with B'Elanna. So I still contend that they should have put Harry Kim and B'Elanna, particularly for the first 2 seasons. Harry Kim, from the first episode, like, they called her Maquis and called him Starfleet, and they sort of had this this chemistry there ever since. But no, they just ignored that for whatever. Anyway, let me get into my number 21. Which is Voq and R'Lel from Discovery. Yeah, not much. I don't know if you can call this a relationship. Of course, this is sort of, because this has to do with the whole body swapping, because Voq and R'Lel loved each other, but then Voq became Ash Tyler, and I'm still confused over what that whole process was. But I do know that Ash Tyler saw R'Lel more as someone who sexually assaulted him, and she didn't see herself in that way at all. So the way that Ash Tyler viewed her that way was really offensive to her, and it hurt her feelings. But so it's very confusing, and it has to do with how jumbled this whole plot is, and the whole Klingon plot in Discovery first 2 seasons was a pretty big mess. and so I think that that's just a side effect of why this relationship doesn't work. Anyway, all I have to say about that. Let me get to my number 20, which is Worf and Troy. This was another one seeing relationship thrown in at the final episode of the show. These characters just don't make any sense together. I guess there's the saying the opposite attracts, but even seeing there was never any chemistry between these characters. And it seemed like they just did it because just to look cool. And now I heard an argument before that in the episode Parallels it kind of made sense because Troy was helping him look after his son, and then when he almost died, he asked her to look after his son for him. But there was never really a romantic aspect to that, in my opinion. That was more of, colleagues who appreciate each other, and he appreciated Troy on a personal level as being a good guardian for a child, not necessarily a wife to him. And once they did put them together, particularly in the episode All Good Things, it just seemed it was very cringeworthy. It didn't seem natural. Anyway, let me get into my number 19, and yes, I'm still in the bad, and that's TPol and Tripp, or Charles Tucker III, from Enterprise. So I was just watching this recently, and this is another sort of, let's have a romance going on the ship with just shove these two characters, and the whole way they got together at first with the Vulcan neurotherapy, whatever, it seemed really contrived, especially the way Phlox is kind of pushing them. You have to have the neurotherapy, and it was really intimate, and it just doesn't make sense that Phlox was really forced that upon Tripp. I mean, was he really forcing that on other characters? In fact, I had an episode later that there was a woman who was a Mako, and why didn't he suggest TPol do neurotherapy on her? Eventually he did, but that's only after he went to Tripp first, because it was seen as in a very intimate situation, and because Phlox had to be forced to do that. So I don't know. And once they went into it, it was just annoying to watch on screen. It didn't help the story at all, and it didn't seem natural for the characters. Anyway, let me get into my number 18, which is Chakotay and Sisko. Now, this was kind of just thrown in at the last second, and because Sisko had been appearing as a supporting character on Voyager, and they never suggested anything romantic between her and Chakotay. But one episode, when they wanted to reveal that Sisko was actually a Cardassian spy, they just all of a sudden made up this relationship with Chakotay, and then once she became the villain, she would throw that relationship back in his face. But I never bought it. It seemed entirely constructed out of plot contrivance, because they wanted the villain to be an ex of Chakotay or whatever, and have the romantic aspect to this adversarial relationship, and didn't work. Anyway, let me get into my number 17, which is Kira and Shekar. There's not much to say about this one, other than it was very annoying to see on the screen. Shekar was the resistance leader of the cell that Kira was in during the Bajoran resistance. So they were terrorists together. They were in life and death situations. They were fighting off Cardassians, and it was never, in the first episode he appeared, it was never implied that they had any sort of romantic inclinations at all, and it seems like they were soldiers together. And then all of a sudden it's like, because they wanted to do an episode with Odo crushing on Kira and feeling hurt, it was like, let's just throw these two together, and it just didn't make any sense, didn't work. And then they would often mention, Kira and Shekar are together, and he became the token boyfriend, and he was never that interesting of a character in the first place, but they made him definitely even less interesting when they put him together with Kira, and I never cared about their relationship. So anyway, let me get into my number 16, and we're sticking with Major Kira, and we're going to go Kira and Beryl. This is another one that was kind of shoved together, and it ruined Beryl. Beryl was a pretty actually interesting character before they put these two characters together, because he was seen as, because they had he was a contrast to Wynn, who was more of the ambitious, who used religion in order to gain power. She didn't actually really care about religion. It's all about power for her. Where Beryl actually did care about the spiritual health of the Bajoran, so he was more of an ally to Sisko and the Federation, and Sisko could see that. But then, like, whenever he had scenes with Kira, and especially once they started their relationship, the acting felt horrible. And I don't know if it was the acting or the writing. It just felt off. Like, it was obvious the writers just wanted to shove these two characters together. And they had no chemistry whatsoever. Now, that being said, I did find the episode where Beryl died very touching, and I did buy the relationship for that one episode, which is probably why they rank a bit higher than the ones I mentioned before. But for the most part, it was very cringeworthy to watch. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the average. So I'm done with the bad section, so these next group of romances I'll name coming up, they kind of worked, they kind of didn't. I think for the most part I liked them. I thought they were fine, but nothing really spectacular. So anyway, let me start with my number 15, which is Rom and Lita. So I mean, this couple is kind of cute, because I mean, it's kind of the nerdy guy's fantasy that a kind of geeky guy who's not that attractive ends up with a really, really hot chick. And but more than that, these two characters are very similar and do kind of make a nice match, because they're both shall we say, a bit dim. Even though, like, Rom is a genius, like engineering genius, he's still really dim. and you know, gotta admit, Lita is a bit, but I did kind of like that, because Lita was typically just dating mostly hot men or powerful men, but I kind of like that she realized that that Rom was very similar to her taste. But on the other hand, like, sometimes I just didn't buy that outside did seem a bit too fantastical, and sometimes they didn't really explore this relationship that much. It just popped, like, and they got married like super fast. Like, all of a sudden, like, they barely showed them together, and all of a sudden they were getting married. And I did like when they did delve into this relationship, particularly how she was being a bit of a stepmother to Nog, but not too intrusive, which I really liked. It was a nice touch that she knew she wanted to feel like family, but not sort of impose herself on him. And so whenever they explored this, it was very interesting, but they didn't explore it very often, unfortunately, which is probably why it doesn't rank any higher. Alright, so let me get into my number 14, which is Picard and Vosh. I guess, again, you get back to the opposite attracts thing. It does sort of give you an interesting insight into Picard's character, because you would assume that he would get into a relationship with someone a bit more demure, like that lieutenant that he hooked up with in Lessons, which isn't on the list because it was only one episode, as I said, because that's the type of person you typically expect Jean-Luc to get into. So it was a bit spontaneous that he actually ended up hooking up with a criminal who was very sort of incorrigible, and the relationship was kind of, even though it was only 2 episodes really, it was still kind of interesting to watch, particularly in Cupid, how he tried to keep her at a distance from the rest of the crew, and he didn't know how to integrate those two aspects of his life, particularly the Vosh, who was, again, like, total opposite of his type, so I could see why he would be totally embarrassed by her. But on the other hand, yeah, there wasn't that much to this one, and it didn't buy it all of it all the time. Anyway, let me get to my number 13, which is Benjamin Sisko and Cassidy Yates. There were strengths to this relationship, particularly towards the end of the series. And there are times where it did help the story along because it was kind of portrayed as a realistic relationship where Benjamin had to deal with the struggles of balancing his life. And particularly interesting was the time where he tried to ground Yates and stop her from going on cargo runs because it was too dangerous because of the war, and this created a rift between them, and he had to relent. But for the most part, Cassidy Yates was not a very strong character. For the most part, she was Sisko's girlfriend. And she was introduced as such, so that doesn't help. And she didn't get that strong characterization, particularly in the episode The Way of the Warrior. A lot of people thought that she was the changeling, and I thought this as well, but it was actually just bad acting, which the actress who plays Cassidy Yates is actually a good actress, and particularly as you'll see later, and then she went on to do the Orville, and she's really good in that. But so it wasn't bad acting as much as it was bad writing, and they just couldn't gel, and the character didn't actually much make sense until later in the show. But so this one was okay. So we'll get into my number 12, and this is the controversial pick I kind of alluded to earlier. This is Neelix and Kass. And I've actually said on my channel a lot before that I really like this relationship, so I actually probably intended to rank this a lot higher and have it in the good section and not just the average section. But I had to admit that I was being blind. I was ignoring the negative portrayals side of this relationship, which I think most people hyper focus on, which is why most people would hate this relationship and think it's awful, because there's a lot of times Neelix was overprotective of her and extremely jealous, and those episodes I fucking hated. But the thing with, and I think this really relates to my feeling of Neelix overall and how I think he was treated by Voyager, that Neelix was not an inherently bad character. That if writers actually took the time to write him properly and see how his character could be used, then he was great at times. And I did a whole video about this. Like, there's some episodes where he was outstanding and others he was awful. And the awful ones had to do with writers who didn't know how to handle this character. And I feel the same way about the Neelix and Kass relationship. That when this relationship could be treated as a really strong natural relationship that helped the show along, particularly in the episode Jatrell. I always talk about that. I love the way their relationship was portrayed in that episode, because Kass was a strength to Neelix and went to him, and you could see the loving and caring between both of them, not just Neelix towards her, but you could see how much she valued him and how good she was from him. And there were later episodes where this was true for as well. But then, of course, you had the badly written episodes where it was just Neelix attacking Tom because he was jealous of, Tom flirting with Kass, and oh god, that's awful. But I will say that when they ended this relationship, they ruined Kass's character because they tried to ramp up her sex appeal. I would argue that while they were together, they never tried to ramp up her sex appeal, which is part of the reason why I think it really worked. And they just didn't know what to do with her after they broke them. And plus, the way they broke them up, it made no sense, and that also really irritated me. So I honestly think they should have just kept these two together. I actually like it. Anyway, let me get into my number 11, which is Miles and Keiko O'Brien. Now, this is another one people might object to me having this high, because I've heard a lot of people complain about this, saying it's really annoying and that they never had any love for each other and it seemed like they had no chemistry, but I disagree. I think most people who say stuff like that probably were never married, because I think this is one of the most realistic and truest depictions of a marriage. And because most romances, particularly in TV and movies, glorify or romanticize, as I say, the romantic and portray it like, oh, love at first time, oh, we're so in love. But most of that is just infatuation, really. Because you have that honeymoon period, as they call it, where you're just like, ooh. But being in a long-term marriage is very different than that. You have to learn to live together. You have to learn to compromise. And yes, there's a lot of struggles and there's a lot of fights. But underneath all that, there's a love and understanding, and that you ultimately strengthen each other. And that's what I think was totally portrayed with Miles and Keiko. And now, particularly the earlier seasons, Deep Space Nine, the relationship wasn't handled very well, where she was unhappy being on the station. I think they just wanted to create tension, and they kind of played off a bit well, and I can see why that would be annoying to many people. But for the most part, you did feel, particularly in the later seasons, you did feel that foundation there. And then, of course, they wrote her off the show, had her go to Beijing or whatever, just because they wanted O'Brien to be with the Bashir a bit more, but I already gave my feelings on that, so don't get me started. But anyway, let me go ahead and move over to the next one, which is my number 10. So we're getting into the top 10, but we're still in my average section at the moment. Picard and Beverly Crusher. And I did allude to them at the top, but I totally think this is eligible. And I did kind of like it. I think I did buy that the majority of the relationship was platonic. I think in the first season they really kind of upplayed the romantic aspect more, and they kind of dropped that for other reasons. But I actually liked it more when they did drop it, because it made sense from the character perspective that he was her commanding officer. And not just that, he was her husband's best friend. And that really hampered. And plus, her husband, by the way, died under his command. So that really complicates things, and I see why it would be very rigid. And I didn't think that episode Attach was a particularly good episode, but I do like that exploration of sort of these very dormant feelings that they both had for each other. And I wish we could have seen that explored on screen rather than in All Good Things. They just said, oh, we were married, now we're divorced. I guess there was one scene in All Good Things that took place in the present where that showed Picard and Beverly kiss, but that seemed to come out of nowhere. So I think they could have done more with this, which is why it's not in the good section. But overall, what we did get, I think, was very convincing and true to the characters and helped the story along. So, we'll get to my number 9, which is Chakotay and Janeway, another one I alluded to in my introduction. Now, it's funny because Kate Madru played Janeway, was very much against any romance between these two characters, and I could see why. And I was personally against it too. I like the episode Resolutions that explored the romantic relationships. I actually refused to watch because I thought it was such a stupid idea, because it was a TV trope that they always have to have two leads. If there's a male and female lead of a show, they always have to hook up, and that really annoys me. Why can't they just have even Mulder and Scully had to have a romance? Why can't men and women have a platonic relationship? God damn it. But once I did watch that episode of Resolutions, I was surprised that they totally sold it. They totally bought it. And I think that you might argue, well, they never had a full-on romance, and that's part of why I think this relationship is so good. And I do think it definitely had romantic aspects to it, because in that episode, Chakotay and Janeway were stranded on the planet, and so I thought they would never get back to Voyager, and Voyager moved on without them, and that they would live the rest of their lives together. And so they dropped the whole I'm your commanding officer, because it was a totally different situation. They found once those barriers were dropped, they did have these underlying feelings. And that one line Chakotay said to her about, he made up this myth about Indian Native American tribes, but that basically just described his feelings towards her. Like, that was such a powerful scene. It made total sense, and I totally bought it. And it was so powerful when they went back to the ship and those barriers were right back up. So we're right back into, yes, Captain, and strictly professional relationship. And sort of the underlining tragedy behind that was so powerful because it was very subtle. But ever since then, Chakotay and Janeway had a very strong relationship. Like, they always have dinner together, and they always discuss things together, but it never went into romance because they knew it couldn't. They knew they had to have that, but they found that balance between being close and being professional, but they couldn't bring being romantic in it at all. And I love that. I think that was a very realistic and powerful relationship. So anyway, let me now get into the best, or the good, sorry. So this is my last section, the good. These are the romances that I think really worked in the show. So let me start with my number 8, which is Michael Burnham and Ash Tyler. Now, I know a lot of people might really object to me for me having this high, particularly in my good section, but I don't care. I actually do think that this is one of the stronger aspects of the first 2 seasons of Discovery, which did have a lot of issues, particularly season 1. But I like the way this was portrayed, and I think it was very natural to the characters and really helped flesh them out, particularly Michael Burnham, because it showed how she was raised on Vulcan. She was raised to be very rigid and emotionless, and so she always closed herself off to any sort of relationship, and how she slowly started to form one with Ash Tyler, who of course was going through his own issues, being a Klingon spy. And, from his perspective, he was suffering from abuse and torture, and how they found solace in each other. And I love the way they played off it once it was revealed that he was Vogue, and how he actively tried to kill her, and how damaging this was for her, and how it affected, and then seeing them reunited in season 2 and all the mixed feelings they had, and how they didn't really know how to deal with each other after being through all that. I think it was quite powerful, quite frankly. And I do think it was one of the better aspects of a problematic first 2 seasons of Discovery. I think it's one of the things they did get right. Anyway, let me get into my number 7, which is Worf and K'Ehleyr. So this only lasted 2 episodes, but even so, like, this was a pretty powerful romance, because in the first episode you had Worf, who was the traditionalist Klingon, with K'Ehleyr, who was half human, tended to be more on our human side, and of course Worf had the human aspects as well. They tried to deny, and how he tried to marry her, but she refused, and then a couple years later she comes back and she has his son. Like, that was powerful. But of course, this relationship is good storytelling. It was a very tragic relationship, of course, because she's killed and Worf has to raise his son together, and she wants to be with him, but at this point he's refusing because of political reasons, and so she explores those political reasons, and it gets her killed. So very tragic romance, which is why it's very powerful. So anyway, we get to my number 6, which is Colbert and Stamets. Yes, another Discovery one in my top 10. What can I say? Colbert and Stamets, of course, the first same-sex couple, are the only same-sex couple that appear on this list. I would argue, the only long-term one in Star Trek. And of course, that's not why it's here this high. It's here because I think the relationship really works. I really bought it. This is an opposite attracts thing that I actually buy. It kind of makes sense because they have, even though they're very different in some ways, Stamets is, particularly in the first couple of episodes of the show, was very snarky and not easy to get along with, where Colbert was very easy to get along with. They both had that sort of this similarities. They were similar enough in other ways that made their relationship really work. And then, of course, they had the arc where Colbert actually died, and how negatively this affected Stamets, and how he wanted to resign from Starfleet. And then, of course, Colbert came back to life, but he was going through his own issues because he didn't feel like he was the same man. So he first rejected Stamets, who was being very clingy because he had went through this trauma of losing the person he loves and then bringing them back. So he thought it was a miracle, but that's not how Colbert seen it, because he was still trying to deal with his own issues of who is he? Is he the same person he was before he died? And I thought that was the way they played this off was very well. It made a lot of sense. And I've heard other people say that they didn't buy when Colbert went back to Stamets, which I completely disagree with, because I think there was that underlining strength between their relationship. There was the love there. Colbert just had to deal with his shit first, and Stamets eventually realized that he needed to give him the space to do that. And so when they got back together, I totally bought it. Anyway, let me get to my number 5, which is Bashir and Ezri Dax. Now, I've heard a lot of people, I just read an article that said they thought this was a bad idea, and I've heard a lot of people slam this one. And in the novels that came after Deep Space Nine, that tried to, say what happened after the show ended, one of the first things they did was to break up these characters, which I totally disagree with. I love this romance. Now, I can see the counter-argument to this, because it seems like the only reason Julian liked Ezri is because he had a crush on Jadzia, and so his feelings towards Ezri are kind of tainted because they're conflated with his feelings towards Jadzia, and that's certainly how the novels played it off. But I disagree. I think that's bullshit. I think the character of Ezri, judging her on her own marriage for herself, just forgetting the Dax thing, she's very flighty, very not kind of all together, and that's kind of exactly how Julian is. Like, if you just forget about that whole Dax thing and just look at these characters as they are, they're like a perfect match. Because Julian always had that boyish quality to him, even in dark times during the Dominion War, and that kind of really complements Ezri's sense of also. And so putting these two characters together, to me, made total complete sense. And I do think that they made it clear in that ending arc that Julian did reconcile his feelings towards Jadzia and Ezri as being completely different. And that's something he struggled with at the start of season 7, which of course he was very confused at first. And Worf even threatened him at one point, saying it would dishonor Jadzia to get with her. And so at first, when he was the initial attraction to her were based on that. But I think they made it clear, they did that journey, they made it clear that he saw her for who her was, and who she really was. And I think even though there will always be that aspect because she is Dax, and it's kind of a second chance for Julian, because the Julian Jadzia thing didn't really work, but the Julian and Ezri thing, it totally, as I said, these characters are perfect for each other. And as for something I did like about the documentary, What We Left Behind, where the writers got together and they wrote a mythical premiere, first episode of season 8 that took place 20 years later, and Ezri and Julian were still together. Now that I love. Anyway, let me get into my number 4, which is 7 of 9 and the Doctor. Now, you might argue that this wasn't an ongoing romantic relationship. It was more like a crush the Doctor had on 7. But I'm going to count it, because that one episode, Someone to Watch Over Me, they did explore this relationship. And these two characters had such chemistry. It was so natural and it was like someone who, the relationship that the Doctor had started like a mentor relationship, but it felt natural, the progression of the Doctor would develop feelings for her, and that he's really the only character that felt right for 7 of 9, if I'm going to be honest, because they kind of toyed with the thing with her and Harry Kim, and then of course Chakotay later on, but the Doctor was only because he also had a unique experience of being an artificial intelligence, a hologram, where 709 was always thought of herself as very Borg and religious and rigid, I should say. And the Doctor was sort of her tutor of teaching her how to be human, which is kind of ironic when you think about it, because he's not human. He had to learn how to be human himself, but he was trying to transmit those experiences, and through doing that, he related to her on that level, and they shared their similarities. Now, I talked before about how Voyager's romances were worse in Deep Space Nine because the producers would shoot down any natural progression, and this is what I meant. The 709, because the worst thing about that episode, Someone to Watch Over Me, was the fact that they didn't end up together, or at the very least the Doctor didn't end up expressing a relationship, which was the writer's original intention. But guess what? The producers, Rick Berman in particular, said, no! You can't have these two together. I still cannot, to this day, imagine why. And if you look at the fan reaction, like the online, all the shippers or whatever, and the websites that were used to pervert it, everyone loved the Doctor and 709 together. All the audience, all the fans, they wanted them together. And when they threw her with Chakotay instead, people were rightfully outraged. And again, the Chakotay 709 thing was a decree from Rick Berman. So why? And this is why the Voyager romances didn't work, because they were all decrees from business executives instead of where the Deep Space Nine, there were writers looking, building off of the natural chemistry that already existed between these characters and bringing it to its natural conclusions, which is what the writers tried to do with these two characters, but of course the stupid ass business execs said no, but the fans knew better. Anyway, like I remember there was a convention where someone even said this to Jerry Ryan, and she's like, yeah, I agree. She's like, I think I had good chemistry with the Doctor, but they threw us with Chakotay, which didn't work at all. But anyway, now we get to my number 3, which is Worf and Ezri Dax. Now, this is other than Tom and B'Elanna, this is the other marriage between main characters in the Star Trek franchise, and this one I think really worked. Now, I was surprised to learn that this wasn't actually a natural, that the writers did make a conscious decision to put these two characters together from the very beginning, and they started slowly building towards it, but they did such a good job at it that they fooled me. Unlike Tom and B'Elanna, where I wasn't fooled at all, that felt stilted and contrived, where this did feel natural, and because Ezri always had that Klingon background to her, and she was established to have that culture, and these characters had a natural chemistry to each other. Now, there are times where this relationship didn't work, particularly Let He Who Was Without Sin, which is a huge example, where it just felt like these characters had no chemistry and they were just yammering at each other. But that's only a few exceptions. It's like the opposite of Tom and B'Elanna, where the only couple times it worked, with the broken clock thing, where here is like only a couple times it didn't work. Most of the time it did, particularly the episode Change of Heart, where Worf had to almost sacrifice his career in order. He basically damaged their war effort that could have resulted in millions of lives in order to save her life. And that really portrayed the power of their relationship, and I totally bought them, and I think it was one of the more heartfelt romances that really worked for the story. Alright, let's get to my number 2, which is Kira and Odo. So this is another one I've heard a lot of people bash, although I brought this up a lot on my channel, and I have gotten a lot of responses of people who agree with me that this is a good one. But I still hear bash from time to time, but I'm sorry, I disagree. I think this is probably the best example of the writers catching on to natural chemistry that exists between characters and concluding it and taking it to its natural conclusion and developing it, and it felt very natural, very real. I think it really helped the show overall. I actually, if any complaint I had, was that I think they dragged on the aspect of Odo having unrequited love for Kira a bit too long. And maybe they could have, when they actually finally did get together, it should have happened earlier, and they could have done a better job rather than involving Vic Fontaine. And I can see why some people didn't really like it to begin with, because let's be fair, at first, like that first kiss was not very convincing, and I think at first the actors didn't really know how to play this at first. But I think, as I said, there was a natural chemistry. This is something I talk about in the documentary even. There's a natural chemistry these actors had together, and building off this relationship that these characters had. I think they were just a bit confused at first on how to portray it in a full-on romantic relationship. But once it really got going in season 7, they did a great job with it. It was totally convincing, and I think it was very powerful for the ending set of episodes when Odo's life was at risk. You could see Kira like having that fight within her with wanting to help him, but not knowing that he hates people pitying him, so keeping him at a distance and still showing how much he cares. And then when they had to part ways, when he went to live in the Great Length, that was a truly heartbreaking moment. Tears were shed. I know a lot of people have said that, and that's because you bought their relationship. You bought their love for each other. I think it was very strong for the show. It was a definite positive. Very glad they put these two. I think this is one of the best examples in Star Trek of having why it works when you put certain characters together. Anyway, let me get into my number one favorite ongoing romance in Star Trek. And that is Commander Riker and Counselor Troi. And there's some people don't like this, but it's not a well-hated one. The whole show begins with them being ex-lovers, and they have that sort of connection. But for the most part, they're friends. They have a platonic relationship, but a very close relationship, and it's portrayed throughout. And this is portrayed as a very caring relationship. Now, as I said, this is not what I'm judging this countdown on, but it worked for the show. It worked for the characters to have this really close, caring relationship that you totally buy. And of course, for the most part, it wasn't romantic until we got to, there was always touches of that here and there, and sometimes it dealt with jealousy. But the one time it dealt with jealousy that I love the most is when Counselor Troi got into she had a romance with this very squirmy guy, and he tried to throw that in Riker's face to taunt him with it. It's like, oh, you lost Deanna, and now I'm going to take her from you. And he just smiled and said, that's the first mistake I've ever seen you make. And he said, if you can make Deanna happy, nothing would make me happier. And I believe he was sincere. Like, this dude was part Betazoid. He could read emotions, and you could see from the reactions on the face that he could tell that Riker was not lying. And that was definitely a strength of the relationship. But when they did finally get together in the films, even though it was kind of rushed because they're films, you don't have enough time to sort of truly develop it the way shows would, it felt natural. It made a lot of sense. I'm glad they finally concluded that way, and of course concluded with them actually getting married, which again, you saw the kind of really healthy relationship and how much Riker really cared for her and stood up for her, and how she took solace in that relationship as well. And of course, they had episodes where their past relationship was explored with, like, through second chances with another version of Riker, where, our Commander Riker was a bit jealous, which makes sense, because it would bring up a lot of feelings of regret. So that was actually kind of powerful too. So yeah, I do think this is the best long-term ongoing relationship in all of Star Trek. Even though it wasn't always romantic, sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't, but it was always the strength of the show, and always very realistic, and always really relatable, and showing two people in a loving, caring relationship. So that is it for my little shippers fan servicey video. Thank you so much for watching this. Be sure to check out my channel as I do many more Star Trek videos, and I also do videos on other shows like Lost, The Expanse, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.